Now you got to remember to turn back on the recording.
All right,
We just
recording
did.
back on, and here we go. GPS for the soul. We're looking at chapter 19. We might even do chapter 20 tonight. Let's see how it goes. And what I was thinking about, trying to think of some examples that would fit in. And I'm going to come back to the idea of the years that we were teenagers. Now I know that's been decades, but maybe even half a century. But
Prehistoric.
I never was a teenager. I was in Germany during those years, and that concept didn't exist.
yeah, no, understood. But this part might. So there were times as a teenager that I can remember when I knew I was wrong.
No.
And I still got defensive. And tried to defend, right? But in the meantime, it's like, but I know. So like, how is it when you know something and you know it totally, 100%, and yet, so I think that's what fits into this chapter, right? Because essentially what we're talking about is that we talked previously about if you understand that there's a God and that nothing happens outside of God and that everything God does is good, so everything's good. So it's perfect. It's absolutely perfect, right?
Right.
When does that not work? When it's personal.
When you misbehave?
Exactly. When it's personal, right? So it doesn't work when it affects the ego, the self. It makes sense that the clearest reminder of this example is during our teenage years, because Hasidus teaches us that the animal soul comes in when you're born, 100%, all the way there, right? Which is why kids are all about themselves, and everything is catastrophic, every little thing, right? Mm-hmm. But as we grow older and our intellect grows, our nefesh elokis, our godly soul, slowly starts to enter. And about the time we're bar or bas mitzvah, that's when the godly neshama, the godly soul, has actually fully entered in. But it's behind, like 12 to 13 years behind in how to run this place. So it takes time to slowly overcome the animal soul, but there has to be a desire to do so. So the teenage years, 13 till, let's see, how old am I now? The teenage years.
You're an optimist.
Teenage years, there's this struggle between the intellectual godly soul and the animal soul that's been used to running things. And so it's no wonder that the teenage years are tumultuous years, because that's a serious battle.
Right.
Knowing the right thing doesn't mean we actually do it. And we've developed some bad habits over the years, right? So intellectually, we would say, if you know there's a God, you know that God runs the world, and you know that everything God does is good, then everything is perfect. What happens to get in the way is ego. The ego is what gets in the way. Now, in one sense, you want to have a healthy ego, but a healthy one, not one where the animal actually is in control. And if I remember correctly, my teenage years, the animal was definitely in control. Definitely. So we've talking about, if you understood everything about the spiritual world and things, then you'd certainly be only doing godly good things, right? But when this doesn't work, what's the problem here is that there's what we call timtum alev, which really means like a dull heart. That heart is dull because our ego's involved. Our ego's involved in it, and it's all about ich. It's the iPhone, iPad, computer world, right? It's all about ich. It's all about the I, right? And so when I'm offended, I'm insulted or I don't get what I want. Now I'm going to argue, even though I know I'm wrong. But it's that personal affront, that personal ego. So how do we get past that? Because I didn't get what I want, and therefore I'm upset, I'm depressed, or even angry. And here we talk about how to get out of depression, is by understanding that God runs the world. But intellectually, that's not working. The heart is stuffed. So the intellect is not getting through to that. And so therefore, how do you get past that? How do you get that past that? So you have to break the ego. You have to break it down. And here's the quote from the Talmud, from the Zohar, was about, a thick log doesn't catch fire, should be splintered. So the same way, a clogged heart is spiritually insensitive. We have to be able to break that up and break that down, and then already we can build the fire. So how does he do that? So that is done by a serious introspection about cheshbon hanefesh, a serious introspection about who am I, what have I done, realistically, have I accomplished all I can accomplish? And by breaking down our ego and realizing how what low life we really are, right? Then that can motivate us to do teshuvah. That can motivate us to become closer to God and to really connect with God in a way that lifts us up. You think about, people oftentimes think about that a person becomes religious or becomes observant because they hit rock bottom or something, right? When you start to explore more than yourself, a whole different world opens up. And when we start to realize that whole different world, then I'm just a small part of this. And wow, wouldn't it be great if I could actually contribute? So that changes things around. So how do we motivate the feelings of how awesome and wonderful God is in breaking down our ego, that struggle to have an emotional understanding, an emotional intellect about who we really are, what we're really capable of, and how far we are from actually accomplishing that. And the example Chassidus also talks about, again, I say you can't shovel out darkness, but if you bring in a light, then the darkness dissipates of its own, right? And so this darkness, this klipa, which hides the reality from us, we have to understand that too. Why is there darkness when lightness is so much better? Well, you can't appreciate the light if you don't have the dark. So there has to be the darkness in order to have the choice to light it up. But as soon as we light it up, it dissipates, it disappears, it's gone. And the example I find fascinating is, we look at the Parsha where it talks about when the spies go into the land. So we're in the Jews are in the desert. We left Egypt. We received the Torah Mount Sinai. We're headed to Israel, and Moses sends out spies ahead to check out how we're going to get into the land, how best to do this, right? And they come back with this mission that says the land swallows up its people. There's no way we can do this.
Right.
Well, who asked you for your opinion?
Right.
Except for two.
Except for two. Caleb and Yeshua.
Yeah.
But the 10 that did come back with this bad report, right? How was it managed? When the breakout began, Moshe yelled at them. And immediately they backed off. They knew better. When we talk about B'nai Yisrael, the children of Israel are maminim b'nai maminim. They're believers, the children of believers. It's genetically encoded. It's part of who we are. So what got in the way? Some darkness got in the way.
Right.
And so as soon as Moshe reprimanded them and the ego backed off, right? Well, then it was light. Then it was clear as day. Of course we're supposed to go. Of course we'll go. Absolutely. Not a question. Of course we'll go. Right? But that klipa, that ego had to be broken. And that was not going to be broken by Moses explaining to them to the goodness of the land and how God can take care of us. I mean, we just came out of Egypt. You don't know God can take care of us? Intellectually, it's all there. Intellectually, it's all there, right? But ego got involved. And because the ego got involved, they thought, well, we can't make it where you have to be, godly in a physical world, be farmers and be religious. It's too much, right? Well, they're missing the point, right? We can do that actually, and that's the mission, and we're empowered to do that. But self-concerns got in the way, and that's why Moshe yelled at them. He didn't try to intellectually explain it to them. He yelled at them, and then they were broken. Then the ego was broken. And then they were able to say, "Oh, okay, let's go do that." Right?
Too bad Moshe didn't do that when they started with, "We need to send in spies." Too bad Moshe.
There's a question there in the Sikha. There's a Sikha from the Rebbe that talks about why did Moshe agree to sending in spies. So there's two. The first part of that is that the Gemara talks about if I go to buy a horse or a camel, I go to buy a camel, right? And a used camel. And the used camel salesman, I asked him, I said, can it do a mountain track? And the guy says, sure. So can I take it for a run? Can I take it for a run? He said, absolutely, go ahead, right? Okay, well, now I don't need to. Because if he's that confident, then it'll be fine. So when they asked to send out spies, Moshe said, well, we'll check in with God, see if, and God says, well, if you want to, go ahead, right? The permission to go should have been enough. Should have been enough. But again, ego gets involved, right? And that's what we have to deal with, right? It's interesting, but when you show up religious, a beard and a yarmulke or a sheitel, right? So people have expectations of who you are, and we all do, right? That's why it hurts worse when someone whom we look up to, someone who's a religious person, and they do something wrong. It's worse because we put them on a pedestal, right?
Right.
So the challenge is understanding that the Yetzer Hara doesn't stay a young kid while we grow older and more intelligent. The Yetzer Hara comes along and learns everything we're learning along the way and learns some new ideas as well. And all of us who are, well over 60 can talk about the fact that the challenges don't go away. We don't become, we maybe mellow out a little bit, but we're still challenged. I was visiting with somebody the other day, just last night, I was visiting with somebody, and he was talking about, we've been together for a long time, and I've known his father-in-law. It's over 40 years I've known his father-in-law. And he's commenting, he hasn't changed a bit. He's the same Yeka, the same, he's a dear friend of mine from Holland. And he's the same Dutchman he always was. Everything has to be just this way, exacting, it's just funny, right? So we think that as we grow older, the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, the klipa, it gets worse, it gets less, and it's easier to become righteous. No, it isn't. No, it isn't, because the Yetzer Hara is growing right along with us. It doesn't take a rest, and it's learned a few new tricks of its own. And so the battle doesn't become easier. Well, then that's the point, right? The point is that that's what life is all about, is always working to overcome the internal challenges of who we are and what we want to be, what we want to become. And so when we look at other people and we judge them because we think they ought to know better, by the time they are who they are, right? So we don't take into account the fact that their Yetzer Hara has grown just as well. They say that a relative can't be a chassid. A chassid means when you put someone up on a pedestal and you hold them up high and you know them as such a godly saint, right? But a relative knows you when you weren't.
Especially if you grew up with them.
I was at a wedding last night in New York.
Good thing I left Germany then.
I was at a wedding in New York last night, and the wedding was actually between, it was the son and daughter of two young men. Well, obviously they can't be so young anymore, right? They're married.
Exactly.
But young men that I used to babysit for.
Wow.
Two separate families, but I know that dad from before his bar mitzvah, and I know what a little squirt he is. So, it's we grow older, but those who know us closest, they know our frailties, and they know that we're still as challenged as it always is, because we have the same Yetzer Hara, and the Yetzer Hara grew and grew stronger and wiser, just as we did, right?
Right.
So the idea here is that if we're having trouble serving God with joy through the knowledge of, hey, it's God and everything is good, then we need to go back and look at our ego. We need to go back and look at ourselves and do some accounting and say, hey, who am I really? And have I lived up to who I need to be? It says in the Torah testifies that Moshe Rabbeinu was the humblest of all men. He's Moses. How do you be Moses and be humble? And he was a strong leader. He wasn't a weak leader. He was very strong. And when people need to be reprimanded, he was able to do that, right? So how do we say he was the humblest of all men? Because Moshe made a cheshbon nefesh. Moshe made an accounting. The family I was born into was the leadership of the Jewish people. I mean, the genetics are tremendous. And then in addition to that, I had my Jewish mother who was raising me, and I had an Egyptian mother, princess of Egypt. And I grew up in Pharaoh's house. I mean, that which I had, that I was given, if someone else was given all of this, maybe they would have done more with it. Maybe they would have worked harder. Maybe they would have seen more. Quantity and quality. They could have been someone better than me. And so Moses was able to stay humble with the realization of, with everything I've been given, have I really done quantity and quality of what I was capable of? They say that Abzusha of Anapol is a chassid. The Alter Rebbe said, he said, I'm not afraid when I come to the heavenly court that they're going to ask me how come I wasn't like Moses, because I'm not Moses. I'm not going to ask how come you weren't like Eliyahu, because I'm not Eliyahu. I'm terrified they're going to ask, how come you aren't Zusha? How come you didn't be the Zusha you were capable of being? And so with that proper cheshbon and nefesh, that proper soulful inquiry into a reality check of who we are, so that ought to break open the heart, and a broken heart is truly the heart that's whole. Because then we can actually celebrate the greatness. But let's go into chapter 20 for a second, and we say, and let's contradict what we just said. Because that's what we do. We're Jewish, right? That's what we do. Someone asked a question. We asked two questions back on them, right? So, hang on a second. You're telling me that if I'm depressed, then I need to do a cheshbon nefesh and tell myself, well, what a blankety blank I really am. And that's going to make me happy? Wait, hang on. That doesn't make logic, right? But the truth is, it does. It does make logic. It's kind of like you add two negatives, they become, you multiply two negatives, they become a positive, right? So what are we looking at? If we're able to judge ourselves and understand that I'm not who I could be, then what's left is just the godly soul. And the godly soul is a chelik elikam yimal mamish, is an actual part of God. It's an actual part of God's essence. So we stop and think about the godly soul that's within me. This is a part of me, is a godly soul, an infinite soul. So that's phenomenal. So all of a sudden it changes from my ego about me to being, I've got a godly soul that's infinite, that's tremendously powerful. If I could harness that, or rather if I could serve that, if I could harness the animal within me to serve that godly soul, that could be awesome. We say that the Hasidic saying that says that the axe to fell the forest, the handle of the axe comes from the forest, right? So it's I like to use the example of fight fire with fire, right? If there's a fire getting out of control, you create a controlled fire line, and that stops it. It can't go any farther than this, right? So the same thing here is that it's the depression that comes from understanding the level of the ego. So that depression beats out that depression because it's no longer about me. Me, I'm a lost cause. I'm Shmagegi, and I mean, and if you need validation, I mean, I'm married. My wife can tell you all the things that are wrong. So, but if I stop and realize that, then it's not about me. Then it's about the godly soul and what my godly soul can do for others. Now it goes into a whole different program. There's a story in here about the Alter Rebbe. A chassid went to the Alter Rebbe, and he'd been a wealthy man, and then he lost everything, and he goes to the Alter Rebbe, and he's complaining about all the things that are wrong. And then at some point there's a pause, and the Alter Rebbe says, everything you told me so far is about what you need. Have you ever stopped to consider what you are needed for? What you are needed for? Then it becomes the question of, I've got a godly soul. I'm here for a mission. What's my mission? And we start to focus on that. What am I here for? Who am I here to help? What is it that I'm here to accomplish? And that all comes back then to the godly soul. So once we start focusing not on ourselves and our ego, because we know enough about ourselves to know where we really are, but actually what our mission here to accomplish, what God wants from us. All right, so now we can move forward. Now we can move forward. And that's what brings the joy, is the movement forward. So we talked about it previously, the difference between atzvus and merirus. Atzvus and merirus. So the difference between atzvus is depression, which is all about me, and I didn't get my way, or I didn't get what I deserve, or that's all about me. That's the atzvus, depression. Merirus is the bitterness between here's where I am, but here's where I could be. And the bitterness of what's holding me back from becoming what I really could be. And there's the energy. That's where the energy comes from. The energy comes from eliminating the depression about me and focusing on my mission that I'm here to accomplish. That's the godly soul. And then that pulls us forward, and that pulls us out of the depression. And it pulls us forward to actually doing something, because we're bitter about our actual lot, because we've done a true accounting of ourselves. And now we want to move forward to what we really could be. And what could we be? Well, we have a godly soul. There's an infinite amount that we could accomplish. We just have to step into it. We just have to move forward to it. And the impetus to do that is that vacuum between here's where I am and here's where I could be. And that's what then draws us forward, right? So we have to break down the ego and the Yetzer Hara in order to then see the vision of what we could be. And that's what pulls us and attracts us forward. In Chassidus, we talk about a yerida l'tzorach aliyah, a descent for the sake of an ascent. And the simplest example of that, and I've done this with my students at school, actually at my, 6th grade and 8th grade students, stand up straight and tall and jump up from there without bending your knees, without going down, go up. You can't go very far from there, right? But if you bend down, then you can jump up, and that reaction then becomes much stronger. It's the same thing when pulling on a slingshot. The farther back you pull, the farther it can go, right? So it's the yerida l'tzorach aliyah. It's the descent, not just for its own sake, but for the descent for the sake of an ascent. So having the depression that comes from an accounting of where we're really at, creating that gap between where we're at and where we could be, that can be very motivating. That can take us forward. That can create for us the springboard to do so much more. So we have so taking 2 chapters together, we have, if we're not inspired by the fact that everything God does is great and good and it's a perfect place for us to be, and we're not joyful because of that, how do we become joyful? We take down the ego with a full evaluation of our pros and our cons, our ups and our downs, and we do a full accounting on that one. And then we look at where we could be, because we have a godly soul within us. And now we have that bitterness of where I could be, where I'm not. That should draw me forward. That can cause joy, because I have so much more that I can do and I'm capable of doing. But it takes a true accounting to do so. And that accounting is the yerida, the going down, the downside of things is to really realize how bad off we are, but then to focus on the godly soul that's capable to bring us up and create that vacuum to draw us forward. And that's the yerida l'tzorach aliyah. All we have to do is focus on our godly soul and what it can accomplish, and how we need to move forward for that. There's later on in the Tanya, there's another part we talk about, another aspect of our meditations that we talk about, which is when we study Torah, like we are right here together now, right? When we study Torah, what are we actually doing? God's infinite wisdom has been compacted into the scroll of the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, the words and the letters of Torah. God's infinite wisdom is confined down into that. And we study that. While we're studying Torah, we are learning God's infinite wisdom. We're learning the Rotzein Elyon, the divine will, God's desire for the world. So when we're learning that, our human mind is encompassing an infinite concept to our capacity, to the capacity we are. But like, you know, when you hug the king, it doesn't matter how many garments he's wearing, you're still hugging the king, right? So when we wrap our minds around these ideas that we're talking about right now, which are godly ideas from the Torah, our mind is actually grasping God's infinite wisdom in a compact form. So we're encompassing the wisdom of God, while that supernal wisdom is encompassing our mind. And it's this tremendous union that's happening, this tremendous unification with God that's mind-blowing, right? How come we're not blown away? Because we don't really understand what that means. Because we're finite human beings. We're little, and so what do we know, right? But if we could understand that, then we'd be completely consumed. In Parshas Yisro, we talk about the giving of the Torah. And God gave the first 2 commandments to the Jewish people directly. God spoke to the Jewish people one-on-one, to everyone, collectively. And in each of those commandments, our souls expired. It was overwhelming. It was short-circuited. It was just too much. It was overwhelming. And so our souls reunited with God completely and left the body empty. And God said, that's not the intention. And he put the souls back in. And he gave the 2nd commandment. And we all died again. And he said, okay, back in. He put the souls back in the bodies, right? And at that point, we said, okay, time out. Dying twice in one day is enough. Let's stop here. And let's have Moses be the intermediary, and you get it and you bring it to us, and let's have that bridge in between, right? Because we can't manage that infinite revelation within our little finite being. But that's the gift. That's the gift, because if we truly understood, if we could truly integrate that idea, then we'd cease to exist, because we get lost up in God's infiniteness. But because we're human, because we're almost like an animal, we don't understand that properly. But it's only because we don't understand that we can actually do this. Which is another idea that would be mind-blowing if we could actually really grasp that. So we have to intellectually try and understand as much as we can and bring that intellectual understanding into a motivation for the day-to-day, so that we realize that when we're sitting here and learning Torah, we waste away the angels. They can't even be in the room when we're doing this, because it's too much godliness being revealed. We don't see it, we don't feel it. Okay, but that's because we would be blown away too. All right, so it's a good thing we don't. But at the end of the day, we have a godly soul within us, and when we sit and learn Torah, we're touching the infinite, and it's amazing, and it's awesome, and that should be enough cause to be joyful all day long. And if it's not, check the ego. Check the ego. Right? And take an awareness of how to not to get caught up into the world. Slowly but surely, we have to get the animal in service to God, and we'll talk more about that as we go along, right? But the idea of these 2 classes together was that if we understand God, runs the world and everything that God does is good and everything is perfect, then everything should be joyful. If that's not working, check the ego and break the ego with a complete evaluation of what we're really like and who we really are. And are we actually accomplishing all that we're truly capable of? And that should break the ego when we can focus on the God of the soul and the potential that we really have, and that can be motivating and joyful and exciting because we have the opportunity to accomplish so much through our Torah and mitzvahs. I shared a little story last night. At the wedding, there were charity boxes on the table, and there were nickels on a plate around the charity box. And there was this 5-year-old kid going around to the tables and collecting the nickels so he could put them into the boxes. He was having fun giving tzedakah in the boxes. So I called him. He came to my table and he was taking the coins off my table. And I provided them. I handed them freely, right? And I said, have you seen this? It's a digital pushka. There's an app for that, right? And I showed him how he could push the buttons at the bottom. Watch this. And the coin drops in and you hear the clinking of the coin, right? And he liked that. And so he pushed another one. And I said, go. He pushed another one and he pushed another one. In the meantime, his father's getting nervous because he's spending my money. Little does he understand that I'm having just as much fun as the kid is. Because I get to watch the kid light up, right? This is happening, right? Within a few minutes of the time that happened, an old friend of mine walked into the wedding hall. He's the designer of the app. And I went and told him what had just happened and how this digital app has been a real game changer in my capacity to give tzedakah. And his response was, yeah, I know, we're getting twice as much from you now. But I don't carry change. And the coin pushka till it fills, and then I turn around and I empty it, and I have to count the coins because the banks don't do that anymore. And it's just one step after another. This digital one, it's phenomenal. I love it. I love it. And so I share that story because as we rejoice in the mitzvahs, as we rejoice in the intangible, infinite activities we connect with God through, that can bring the joy. That can bring the joy. And so we want to focus on, again, the infinite opportunities that we have through the Torah study and the doing of mitzvahs and what that can truly accomplish.